You're listening to Clock the Tea with Dr. Long. Hello, and welcome to a new episode of Clock the Tea with Dr. Long. This is your host, Mark Long, bringing you that fresh tea every single week. And of course, we're going to get into politics, but we're also going to talk about a little fun things that might impact a lot of you who have furry friends. But before we get there, I want to remind everyone to please vote. Vote honestly like your life depends on it. We have a lot of things going on in this country, but one thing I definitely want to make sure I put out there is that if you don't like the way things are right now with grocery prices, this pointless war that's impacting us here with oil, you need to take it to the polls and make a difference. And what better way to make a difference than sticking your middle finger up by using your voice to make a difference for those around you, showing that you actually care about people and the lives of folks who cannot afford everyday life? This is the best way to do it. So, big ups to you all who are staying in the know about politics and everything that's happening. So why don't we just start there and get to the tea? So the Wisconsin primary is actually heating up pretty nicely here. With Hong is in the lead right now. Actually, she's kind of climbing past Crawley and a few other people. We saw a few candidates drop out of the race and endorse other people like Rodriguez, and we know Barnes is hanging in as well. So it's interesting considering our last conversation about the local election because Crawley was the candidate that was getting a lot of the funding and a lot of the connections within the Milwaukee area. Whereas Barnes and Rodriguez have an advantage having one, Barnes was lieutenant governor with Evers at one point, and Sarah Rodriguez is the current lieutenant governor with Evers. So it's interesting to see how the playing field is leveling out. But most importantly, let's look into Francesca Hong because she's actually planning on sitting down with, I believe his name is Hassan Piker, who is a YouTuber who does a lot of commentary on politics, especially about what's happening with foreign affairs and the current administration. And she's going to sit down and have a conversation with Hassan about her platform, about what it means to be a socialist who is running for a very important political office, which is the governor of our beautiful Dairyland. And she's going to talk a bit more about why people should vote for her. And how cool would it be to have a Democrat governor once again in Wisconsin, but most importantly, someone who is championing what it means to uplift the lives of marginalized communities the way that she has done. I mean, she speaks to that. She has lived experience, and I think we should check out a clip. Let's take a listen.
Did you know that the ultra-rich and mega corporations pay a lower tax rate than everyday Wisconsinites like you and me? So when we say tax the ultra-rich, we mean fairness, fiscal responsibility, funding our future, and fixing a rigged system.
That is Wisconsin State Representative and self-described Democratic Socialist Francesca Hong, who last year launched what many would consider a long-shot candidacy for Wisconsin governor. But early polls show her as one of the front runners ahead of the Democratic Party on August 11th. Representative Hong joins us now, and I'll refer to you as Francesca. So you are a chef, a bartender, single mom. You've served as a state rep since 2020. Your platform's described as deeply progressive. You advocate for universal childcare, rolling back school vouchers, raising teachers' salaries and the minimum wage, taxing corporations and high earners, just to name a few. What is it about you think your story and your message that you think is resonating with primary voters, Francesca?
Many working class people have felt left behind, and to know that there's someone who is a working class person right now fighting for these very practical policies, that's resonating with folks all across the state.
Well, as you know, Democratic Socialist Zohran Mamdani won the New York City mayoral race last year. In the Los Angeles mayoral race, two of the candidates, Spencer Pratt and Nithya Raman, they differ politically, but they both say that the establishment incumbent, Karen Bass, failed their city. Do you think this is a new brand of politics, and do you see yourself in that mold?
A brand of politics that is centering working class people, I think, is a brand of politics that we should all be fighting for. And as the state representative for a very progressive district, I've carried my message to rural, urban, and suburban areas, and it's resonating. I think that this is what folks demand and deserve from their government.
Wow, it's interesting to hear Francesca Hong talk about issues on a national level because I know that she It seems like a long shot. I'm just going to be honest. It seems like a long shot for Wisconsin, the state of Wisconsin, to elect a socialist Democrat, but more specifically, someone who's that progressive, right? And Francesca Hong aligns a lot with what I believe in. She is a progressive liberal the way that I am. And I believe her constituents and who she represents here in Madison appreciate that she's even speaking to some of these issues that the current administration doesn't speak to as much, or where we haven't seen a lot of movement. So it's not anything against Tony Evers. It's just the fact of certain issues are still important for Americans, but most importantly for people here in the state of Wisconsin. And a lot of things that Hong talks about, for example, with education and childcare, she's committed to fully funding public schools and universities, while also introducing statewide free school meals and universal childcare, which is very important. And I can tell you why that's important. It's important because I believe Hong is also a parent, and she knows, a single parent if at that, and she knows what it's like to have resources and to not have resources. And as a person of color, I assume that she's also meaning that these options for universal childcare are going to be accessible for those who live in communities that are more disenfranchised, but most importantly, that people who are out of the status quo, who live in rural areas, who are not someone who has a silver spoon handed to them at birth, that they have options where they can save money and also make sure that their children are taken care of and that their children are fed, right? I think that's super important. And Hong also speaks to a few other issues that I think we should talk about. So here in the state of Wisconsin, there's been a lot of talk about these data centers coming up and how they will technically cause utility spikes in regards to our bills and energy costs. And she's very, very, very adamant about enacting a 1-year freeze on the construction of new AI and cryptocurrency data centers, which is super important considering that that's been an issue of concern for a lot of residents here in the state. And I think that just speaks to what's important to her. She also talks a lot about how she wants to protect clean water here in the state. And she wants to make sure that she's protecting tenant rights and investing in community land trusts and raising wages for workers. All things that current administrations and other candidates have spoken about before. But I think the difference about it coming from Hong is that she, over the time of her work here in Madison, she has put her money where her mouth is. She has spoken on these issues, but also been a voice of a huge voice here in our progressive city of Madison by expanding some of these issues and highlighting why it's important for residents to focus on affordability and focus on access to care, access to healthcare, access to education, access to better paying work, access to higher wages. She speaks to that all the time. So by talking about expanding Medicare as she does at the local level and introducing a state public option, something that is completely not available, right, for residents here in Wisconsin, this is all important because she also mentions regulating healthcare claim denials and what that means for people who are looking to afford the medications and how to do that. And Hong is speaking to issues that impact everyday middle of the road people who might live in rural Wisconsin, who might live in the cities, might live in Milwaukee or somewhere up north or Kenosha near the border. And there's a lot of issues that people skip over, you know? The current momentum with Hong right now is that she experienced a surge in momentum considering the fact that the polling with Mandela Barnes is not that great. Now, she has some key endorsements. Hong also is a high-profile progressive candidate that a lot of grassroots people are backing. So you can head to her website to see who some of those partners are. Or if you just want to learn some more about Francesca Hong, just visit her website and I can give you the name of it. It is francescahong.com. All right, tea sippers, let's shift some gears and talk about what's happening here in the country right now. So the president of the United States, or whatever he wants to call himself, dictator, idiot, completely egregious person, joke, has decided to not sign the housing bill that was bipartisan that Republicans actually pushed because there's so much writing on this. Now, why else would he do this? Is he trying to save his ass? I assume he is. I assume he's trying to delay any way he can to keep power, but most importantly, he claims it's because the SAFE Act is not being pushed through. Donald Trump is so egregious. Take a listen to this.
If you ever want to know why we always keep our phones close, it's because the news is actively happening while we're on the air, including 2 minutes ago, where President Trump put a post on Truth Social saying that he was actually canceling signing that big bipartisan housing bill that just passed. Again, bipartisan through Congress. Trump was supposed to sign it today. Now he's saying he is canceling it until such time as we pass the Save America Act. He says he considers that bill to be a national emergency. This is once again, as we were talking about potential own goals from the president to Republicans in Congress, many of these Republicans planned to run on this bill, trying to tackle affordability issues ahead of the midterms. Of course, Democrats were going to do the same thing. It all now comes, of course, as President Trump is still lashing out on Truth Social at other lawmakers for passing a different resolution. This one would have blocked him from resuming the Iran war. He wrote on Truth Social that he has, quote, Iran on the ropes, and that the Senate just made his job more difficult.
Wow. I wouldn't put it past Trump to just completely just destroy America at this point, because why would you not sign a bipartisan bill to help the efforts of Republicans keeping their power to have you have a little bit more room to be a disaster like you already are? But anyway, let's talk a little bit more about this, T-Sippers, because this housing bill was intended to actually help increase U.S. housing supply, right? That's one core of the bill that we knew about. But some other things that the bill talked about was lowering housing costs for renters and buyers, converting old vacant buildings, especially in metropolitan communities, providing incentives for local homelessness solutions, specifically for those who are looking to attain housing if you are unhoused due to being disabled or being a veteran, providing some kind of rural housing streamlining, which we know in Wisconsin that can go a long way. There was also some talk in this bill about limiting institutional investor dominance in single family housing, which has been a huge problem for the past couple of decades. Now, some other things that were supposed to be addressed in this bill were things like whole home repairs, so some kind of rehab funding for those who want to build more in the United States, for there to be some kind of housing planning grants for people who are working in this field of creating more innovative construction around homes, and also more efforts to streamline more opportunity zone housing incentives. While also there is some talk in this bill about what they're doing for financial literacy or home buying literacy for improving Americans' access to housing counseling and other programs such as mortgage, and how to navigate their mortgages and budgeting for younger folks. And also, obviously, disaster relief reforms were mentioned in there, as well as some things with the VA. So this is just a disaster that Trump knew about this and decided he wanted to just ball it up and focus more on his control with the Iron War and focus more of his efforts on, just being greedy and being an idiot. I think we need to call it what it is. I think Trump is fearful of the midterms and he is trying to stick it to the American people, because I don't really think Trump likes America. Because if you want to take it upon yourself, Donald Trump, to not sign something that would guarantee basically the largest federal housing package in decades that you can even put your name to, it's just weird. Why delay it? It aims to boost the supply. We talked about reducing costs. That sounds like music to the ears of majority of people in America. So if we're talking about federal housing policy being something that's very important for those who are looking to vote because they want to see something change in this country in regards to how they're living every day and what they can afford and how to live the American dream, look no further than DJT, honey, because he's the guy for you, I guess. If you think that he's the answer, someone who won't even make your life easier with the drop of a hat by just signing a bill that is super important and bipartisan, imagine how egregious and how terrible he is to people behind closed doors. And this is the guy that's running the country. Okay. Let's vote him out. Let's get him out of here. At this point, he's just playing with the American people. And he's definitely playing with his voters, for sure. Okay, T-Sippers, let's shift gears away from talking about Donald Trump. He's just a damper, and he's not somebody I'm looking forward to even discussing this summer, but I want to bring you the tea, and that's why I do. I'm going to talk about furry friends, our fur babies, our pets, if you will. whatever y'all call them. I have 2 cats and 2 dogs, so I always am looking for tips to make sure my dogs are having the best time, especially during the summer. Now we have a cat that likes to go outside, so I thought I would take it upon myself to even look at some more tips of how to keep them all cool, because a lot of them like to soak in the sun and just lay there. So, what can we do? Take a listen to this.
Pets can feel that heat long before we do. Here's how to keep them happy and cool in those summer months. Of course, hydration. Plenty of fresh water all day long. If you're outdoors, provide shade and a fan. Not just for you, for them. That's nice. You can find cooling towels for their neck, vest, and cooling mats, all great ways to keep them comfortable. You can keep a misting spray bottle. Spray this underneath your dog. The point is not to get them wet, but just provide a little evaporative cooling where their fur is the thinnest. And it's a great mister for you. Look out for signs of overheating, like excessive panting, drooling, or difficulty breathing. You'll want to keep your pet well brushed and groomed. That extra fur is just going to keep them warm. Interactive toys and puzzle feeders can be great ways to keep them active indoors where it's much cooler. Fun way to keep them busy indoors and cool. All the makings of a chill summer for you and your pets.
Wow, I didn't consider the cooling towels. I'm sure my dogs would love that. But, there's a few other things that we're missing that I want to mention, but most importantly, I think this topic is pretty cool because there's things about having pets that only pet parents really know about. For example, obviously when it's really hot outside, you don't want to take your dog on a long stroll, right? You don't want to bring them around the block. You don't want to act a fool because if you're hot and if you're sweaty just walking 2 minutes, 3 minutes, then they're hot as well, and they're can have a potential of becoming really dehydrated. So I would suggest not doing that. Another thing that I typically like to do with my dogs is make sure I look at their paws and make sure they're not too raw. There's a couple of different like paw balms that you can get from your local pet store that you can kind of rub on there throughout the summer. But most importantly, you want to avoid walking on that hot pavement because the pavement itself traps in more heat and can burn your dog's paws. So I have a backyard, so I typically want to focus more on making sure my dogs have energy that they can get out, which is what the walks serve as. But when it's really hot, they could just play in the backyard. Now, so a few things that I saw that you could do with your dogs in the backyard is, giving them ice that they can chew on. You can freeze like a bowl of water, if you will, and have some fruit that dogs can digest. Obviously, avoid things like grapes that are poisonous for dogs and things of that nature, but you can put things like mango or frozen carrots or things like that, and they can lick on the ice, and that could keep them pretty busy, but also pretty hydrated at the same time and cool. Also, if your backyard has like a lot of different ways where you can set up a little kiddie pool and have water in there, you could always fill that up, and dogs can play around in that. I know a lot of dogs don't really like water. There's some dogs that do. So, just kind of weigh your options and be prepared for somewhat of a mess, but a fun mess because you're going to be hanging out with your furry friends. And I guess last but not least, when it comes to the summer, I like to plan things that are fun for dogs to have some socialization with other dogs because during the summer you get to see a lot of people outside, you get to see a lot of humans, so interaction and socialization is really important for pets, and I think during the summer is a perfect opportunity to create more opportunities for them to do so. So if there's a local dog park, taking them there, obviously being mindful, so bringing your water bottles, or they have like these to-go bowls that you can collapse and fill up with water, so that's also something that can be really awesome. And you can bring your little frozen treats by bringing a little small dog cooler or some kind of lunch box where you can store their frozen treats in there. That's also a good way to keep them cool as they're running around and playing with other pets or meeting other humans. So if you can't tell, I love animals and I love pets. So obviously I'm going to have more topics on the pod about pets. And I want you all to, take precaution and also just enjoy your summer with your fur babies. All right, tea sippers, let's shift gears because it's Pride Month. Happy Pride, everybody. And I think it's super important for us to highlight the fact that it's been 11 years since the Supreme Court made that decision to legalize same-sex marriage, or as I like to say, marriage, across the United States nationwide. It's super important we deserve rulings because I believe our community has been set back so many times, especially with the egregious right and what they try to do with their religion to punish people for being different, like they've done to Black people, like they've done to undocumented people, and definitely like they've done to people within our community. But most importantly, let's take a look back, because I want to start highlighting those trailblazers that actually were themselves in times where you were not allowed to, and it was punishable by death, it was punishable by prison, and it was punishable based on who you were and based on your environment and those around you. They get to decide the crime for you being LGBTQ+. And it was very, very awful. And the fact that we have people within our community that have navigated spaces prior to our existence right now is completely amazing to me. Let's take a listen together.
Today, I'm taking you all the way back to the late 1800s to meet an enslaved person who became a queen. William Dorsey Swan was born into servitude and grew up to become one of the first American activists to spearhead a queer resistance group. He was also the first person known to refer to himself as a queen of drag. And that's not all. Swan was the first person to use the legal and political system to fight for the right of the queer community to gather in America. Ooh, exciting. Hi, y'all. I'm Peppermint, New York City's delightful diva, and welcome to a special episode of Masters of Drag. We start our story on one fine spring night in April 1888. Swan was hosting one of his typical illicit dance parties at a Washington, D.C. dive, and the room was filled by dozens of Black men dressed in women's silks and satins. The police were called, and when they barged in to shut down the party, the attendees scattered, rushing to pull off their wigs and even jumping out of windows. According to the National Republican newspaper, Swan was one of the few who didn't run. In fact, he reportedly stood up to the arresting officers and boldly declared, "You is no gentleman." This act of resistance started a brawl with the officers, in which Swan's cream-colored satin dress was allegedly ripped to shreds. Almost a dozen men escaped arrest, but another dozen, plus a half-naked Swan, were carted off to jail. Articles about the raid in various newspapers identified Swan as the Queen and described how hundreds of people followed the party guests down the road as police arrested them and took them to the local station. Now, it's important to recognize that drag in America, like other African-American art forms, including genres of music and dance, came out of some of the torturous conditions of slavery, where communities came together in secret to find a semblance of joy and self-expression. Swan was no stranger to arrests and police stations. He was detained several more times for hosting his drag parties, which culminated in his detention and conviction in 1896 for keeping a disorderly house, a criminal charge often used against those who ran brothels, and sentenced to 300 days in jail. The exact year of Swan's death remains unknown, but he leaves an undeniable legacy for his drag sisters and queer folk everywhere. Drag history is longer than most of us think, and we are only just beginning.
Wow, what a queen. Literally. William Dorsey Swan made a huge way for a lot of people, especially with just being who they were and just living their life and being unapologetic right after slavery was ended, not maybe 40 years prior to some of the reportings of these findings. So it's so interesting, the tenacity and the integrity of people within our community who live their lives in a resilient way and are able to be themselves among all the hatred in the world and how judgmental religious people and actually institutions can be. And it just comes to show that, life is too short. Be who you are for your pride. Be who you are for your pride, always. And we should start embracing more of this kind of stuff. Start talking about the education around LGBTQ plus rights and those trailblazers that came before us. And also start holding space for conversations that are uncomfortable. Because I think a lot of people just lack the education or understanding of what it's like to be queer and why community and why resiliency and why representation is so important for us. So happy Pride to everyone, for sure. Thank you all so much for listening to another episode of Clock the Tea with Dr. Long. It was a quick episode today, so hopefully next week we'll be able to get you some real good stuff and some real good tea, honey. Thanks for listening. Bye.